Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. Erik Skopil, I'm Matt Prehm, and today we bring on Chris Hummer, National College Football writer, transfer portal czar for 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports. Chris, man, has it died down or is it still just flying by the seat of your pants? Because the portal is technically closed, but it's still always portal season, it feels like.
Yeah, it's slowed down a little bit. Not too much. Haven't really had a day off in a while, but at least the volume in the portal is down significantly. So that does make life a little easier.
Go ahead, Erik.
Well, I thought this was just a good place to start. Just the big picture of this. We now have a couple of years of the portal being in place, and you've been following it closely, I know, for the totality of it. But how would you compare I'm not talking Oregon, just talking nationally. Like what broad strokes maybe stand out about this year? Are there things that you've seen that are differences, or things, does it just feel more of the same? Like what is your kind of big picture, kind of taking a step back and looking at this thing right now?
Well, the volume's up again. I believe last year around this time, there was like 2,700, 2,800 players in the portal. And right now we're at almost 3,000 FBS. So once again, it's jumped. So that's a change. But I think the cycle, big picture wise, the big storyline is NIL, but not just NIL, is rev share. Obviously, the rev share element of that is a little more hypothetical, especially based on some recent rulings by the Department of Education, which I'm sure Oregon fans don't really want to hear me dive into heavily. But what's happening is teams are operating in an environment where they have collective money on one hand, and then they have anticipated rev share money on the other hand coming in. And under the House settlement, fair market value applies to NIL deals. So schools that operate with collectives feel like they almost have to spend their entire collective budget for the year in 6 months ahead of the rev share implementation. So you're going from teams having, let's say, your team has $10 million to spend in your collective, and then they're going to get an additional $15 million in rev share. They're going from a budget of $10 million last year to a budget of potentially $25 million in 2025. And the market has spiked considerably because of that in terms of what players are commanding on the open market. We've had record-setting QB deals. We've had record-setting offensive line deals. Like kickers are getting $150,000. Like it's a very crazy market at the moment. And I think that's been the storyline of the cycle. The money is just really, really high in a way that it hasn't been before.
That was going to be where I was going to go. Prices going up felt like, and that you basically answered it before we could even talk about it. I guess let's pivot there though to Oregon. Oregon has the reputation of being one of the more aggressive programs in spending NIL money. Is that still true? Is it increasing with the price increase across the board for all schools, or what's Oregon's like spending reputation like right now?
I mean, Oregon just got Emmanuel Pregnon from USC, right? Like, did I miss that? So I think that answers the question. Oregon is top tier NIL. I'm sure Oregon will be a top tier rev share whenever it gets there. Kirby Smart, I remember at SEC Media Days. I'm sure Oregon fans remember this too, when he like took a swipe at Oregon and NIL and Phil Knight, and like there's a reason for that. Like Oregon is one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the country in terms of NIL spending. Phil Knight clearly wants to win a championship. Oregon's clearly aligned in those goals. And yeah, I mean, like Oregon will money whip you. There's no question about that.
Chris, reputationally, I'm just curious as well. There's the financial part, which obviously we know is significant in all these recruitments with the NIL now. But just reputationally, in terms of what they put on the field, did you get a sense the run that they had made them a more attractive destination this cycle? Or is it just kind of they've reached a pinnacle or a place where they're just going to be in recruitments for a lot of the top names? Because you look around and I believe they tripped 9 guys and all 9 committed, or very, very close to a 100% success rate. I'm just curious on kind of what you've heard behind the scenes on the success that they've had this cycle, other than the financial component of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Oregon's reached that level in terms of the elite tier of the sport. They've joined Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, kind of in that mix. Texas as well, you'd have to throw in there. There's no question about that. I mean, it's not like this is new success for Oregon. I believe they had a top 5 class in 2024, and I think like a top 8 class in 2023.
Yep.
So this is not new for Dan Lanning. He's recruited at this level for years now, and when you also have the additional investment, and I know it's not all about money, but when you also have that factoring into the idea that you can win championships at Oregon, and Oregon being the number 1 team in the country for a long stretch, despite how that Ohio State game went in the playoffs, like that's a potent combination. And like at the end of the day, like people like youth, people like energy, young players, especially like youth and energy. And it's hard to find a staff with more youth, at least at the high level of the sport. And Oregon staff, not only Dan Lanning, but his offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, several position coaches at or around the age of 30. And that level of energy and engagement, plus like, frankly, like the uniform combinations, like it really matters. Like Oregon's like a cool brand for people. So when you add that to the very competitive NIL, and you have a recipe for outside success, which is what Oregon's seeing right now.
You touched on it, the Title IX Department of Education memo that went out. I was actually going to ask you about that. Could you maybe give us in simpler terms just what this means, what's going to have, what the impact will be from a portal perspective, not just at Oregon, but for everywhere?
Well, I think it's to be determined, because one thing about a memo that goes out essentially 4 days before an administration change is the next administration is free to change that. And I think based on, I'm not trying to make a political statement here whatsoever, but based on political leanings and like the way one party operates versus the other, it seems more likely that the Republican Party will be more favorable towards this particular element of college athletics, which is essentially inequitable pay based on Title IX to players for NIL. I would argue I mean, at the end of the day, like I think it's equitable to pay what they're bringing in, but like I understand the argument. I'm sorry. Let's just roll from the beginning. Basically, right now, the Department of Education came out yesterday and said that NIL payments have to be fair and equal based on Title IX. Before, schools were going to distribute Title IX money or rev share money in an unequal basis. Like a lot of schools, I think the formula is going to be like 70 to 80% for football, 10% for basketball, and the rest of it goes to the other sports, kind of split however you want to do it.
Right.
The government, or at least the Department of Education under Joe Biden, is currently saying that those have to be distributed equally based on Title IX, just like scholarship allotments happen. So that means 50% of the money to men's sports, 50% of the money to women's sports. If that was the case, it would completely ruin the way almost every athletic department in the country was going to operate their budget this year in terms of revenue sharing. So it would have a pretty significant effect, but it's just unclear if that's going to stay the case when the new administration comes in.
I guess, Chris, I'm going to pivot to something we hadn't planned for necessarily, Matt. Give us the feel for where things are at with the Diego Pavia Junior College ruling, and is the expectation or anticipation is ultimately this will be a waiver for years going forward where that won't count towards the eligibility, or does this feel like a 1 year one-off situation? But give listeners kind of a sense of where things stand with that, because that does apply to several of Oregon's current seniors, but then also some underclassmen that they've recruited from the junior college as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little fluid at the moment, at least for this year. Everybody has their year back, but I think there's a segment of players whose clocks are technically up that are going to have more of a fight to just play in 25 than they expect. Those guys from the 2019 class are trying to use that extra year. They are not technically eligible based on at least what the NCAA told me. So we'll see what waivers get applied for that, or what lawsuits come of it, because that seems to be the solution if you have a problem with the NCAA in 2024 or 2025. As for the future, I think we're headed towards a system where players get 5 years to play 5. Like that's just, I think, how we're going to be. I don't think it's going to have, I think we're going to be done with waivers outside of injury. I think red shirts will be gone. I think it'll be 5 to play 5, and you can use it however you want. I don't know if that happens this year. There has been talk about that at the NCAA convention already. I don't know if they're going to pass that rule in the next 6 months or what have you. But if you're talking about what it's going to look like in 5 years, I fully expect players to just have 5 to play 5. I think that's just the direction we're heading.
What are your thoughts, Chris, on the coaches convention this week unanimously requesting the portal window being moved to January and it be 10 days?
Well, I was there. I thought.
Uh-oh. I think we lost Chris.
Y'all got me?
Yep, there you are.
Cool. Y'all, let me just pick up where I was.
Sure.
I don't know if y'all edit this, so I apologize. I'm just talking.
It's all good. We'll do it.
My thought is that they don't really have the power to dictate that as coaches. I understand why they want it. It's more equitable to have that in late January. It allows rosters to stay intact, but I think you're going to have a lot of players push back on that because it restricts movement. And ultimately, it's the NCAA Board of Governors and the Division I Council that makes that decision. And they don't tend to always follow what the coaches ask. Ultimately, it's a recommendation. It's not a rule that the coaches are putting forward. And frankly, based on the way those rules have been litigated in the past, I'd be surprised if that's the direction the NCAA ultimately went.
Let's shift really quickly to Oregon's class. And I don't expect you to break it down like we might on our podcast on our own, just because you're looking at the totality of the commitments that are happening everywhere. But are there names that you've seen Oregon land this portal cycle that kind of stand out to you, or maybe a position group you've seen them address? I guess just broadly, kind of big picture, what are you seeing when you look at what they've been able to achieve so far?
Well, they got probably the top interior offensive lineman. They got the top offensive tackle, and then another top 8 offensive tackle. So that's a pretty good way to address deficiencies in your offensive line room, especially with several graduations and players leaving for the league. So that's a huge deal. I don't know what that says about the development of the offensive line out of high school necessarily, but you don't really have to if you're at a place like Oregon, because you have the ability to go get Isaiah World out of the portal, go get Emmanuel Pregnon out of the portal. Those are players who are going to start right away for you and allow you to be excellent up front, which is what you have to be competitive. So that's huge. Dylan Thieneman is one of my favorite players in the portal. He was our true freshman of the year in 2023. I think he is a eraser on the back end of a defense at free safety. He's got unbelievable range and has the ability to play in the box and tackle. I know we had him been a 90 overall in our rankings, but if I was making my personal rankings, he would have been a top 10 or 20 player in the cycle. I love that kid. I think Mekhi Hughes is an excellent replacement for Jordan James. Obviously, his brother is on the roster, so that certainly helps in a recruitment process. And it wasn't a done deal when he went in that he was going to Oregon, but once Jordan James, I think, ultimately signaled he was moving on, that was as done as it gets. So I think that's a really nice get for Oregon. I don't know if he's going to be as good as Jordan James has been, but he's going to be excellent. And then, I don't know, say what you want about Bear Alexander, but there's not many people his size that move the way he does. So that's a really nice pickup on the interior of the D-line.
Linebacker feels like a room where Oregon needs to get better at, whether that's through spring development and offseason development in-house or going to be in the portal. But it also feels like maybe there isn't a ton of talent. What's just your overarching thoughts on the position group from the linebacker at the portal spot? And could more names maybe hit the portal later?
There's always going to be more names in the spring. I'm not anticipating big linebacker movement here over the next week necessarily, although I've been surprised before. But linebacker is a position that didn't have a ton of depth in the portal, at least high-end depth. I guess Oregon depth is the way to think about that. There are some good players, not some great ones. But I think schools like Oregon, if they really need something, have a way of letting that be known behind the scenes. And I think if they really need a linebacker, one tends to appear at a place like Oregon. So if it looks that way coming out of spring, I don't think I would panic if I was an Oregon fan.
Let's set the stage then for spring a little bit. I know that's a little bit, skipping steps because technically there's still a couple of schools that don't have their, the window hasn't closed for them in this period. But historically, what's been the difference between December and April in terms of, obviously more players are going in December and than in April, but is it typically the caliber of player in April? Where's that usually been? And I'm not going to ask you to project what's going to happen in April, but like, what do you think broadly fans should expect from what's going to happen when that opens again?
I thought an SEC DPP put this to me beautifully last year. In the winter, you're competing for starters, and then in the spring, you're competing for backups in the portal. The quality is way down. Usually, I mean, I don't know what it's going to look like in this new era with the money being thrown around and rev share and everything else, but you're going to see a lot of volume. But I think it's a lot of players who like weren't happy with their place after spring ball and under the portal. The few really high-end players who do go in command a super premium. We saw that last year with a guy like Derek Harmon, who like came close to $1 million, is my understanding, in the portal last year. And that was at the time like very unusual for the position. So you get a lot of leverage if you go in the spring, and I think leverage is the key word. Then, like if you're a really good player going in, you're gonna have a ton of options. And a lot of teams battling for your services. The spring is not a good time to have a significant need. I'll tell you that, because it gets really expensive to fill it.
I'm going to pivot for my last question. Let's actually talk some football and Oregon on field.
Can we do
that? We can. Because I'm curious from like a localized perspective that Oregon's 2024 season feels weird because of the way it ended. Nationally, how should we perceive a 13-0 start to the year or run the regular season? They were number one for almost half the season, but then they get to the Rose Bowl, and obviously we see Ohio State's really good, and they're playing to their potential, and they're a 10-point favorite for a reason. But Oregon just gets obliterated, and the biggest game of the year for them. How do we judge this?
I think it's a successful season overall. I mean, won a Big Ten championship in your first year in the league. It's hard to do much better than that, but I still think there's a difference between, and when you're talking about like operating at full potential, right? Like, which is a level few teams can reach. There's a difference between Ohio State and frankly, like if Georgia was operating at the same capacity too, and they did it this year, there's a difference between Georgia and Ohio State and sometimes Alabama, but like I think Alabama has some like construction issues at the moment due to some of the depth they've lost and also, frankly, the quarterback fit. Those three teams still operate at a different capacity than everybody else. And Oregon is closing that gap through recruiting. You see that with back-to-back top 5 classes, but they're just not quite to that same level. You felt that, especially with the offensive line. What did Oregon average negative yards per carry in the Rose Bowl?
Yes.
Yeah. They finished with negative yards, I believe.
Yeah. So you feel that there. I don't know if a guy like Evan Stewart like necessarily lived up to his potential this year. Like you're banking on guys like that coming in and making an impact. But in reality, like if you're Oregon, you would rather your 5-star recruit from 2 cycles ago emerge as a difference maker as opposed to relying on the portal. So I think Oregon still has a rhythm in terms of development to reach that some other programs at the top, like Ohio State, have managed to hit. But like at the end of the day, like Oregon was one of the 6 best teams in the country, probably. I don't know what number that would be. I feel confident in saying one of the 6 best teams, despite that like year-end result. And I think that shows Oregon's in the right spot. Like, I mean, 4 years ago, we were talking about Mario Cristobal failing to get over the hump in the Pac-12 championship games and coming up short. And Dan Lanning's clearly managed to climb that hurdle, which is a massive hurdle to climb. And the last step is the biggest one. It's the difference between a great team and an elite one. And like Oregon is still working on that. And that begins in the trenches on both sides. Oregon had a good offensive line. Eventually, it didn't start that way, obviously, but they need to have a great one. And like, frankly, like as good as Jordan Birch was at times, as good as Derek Harmon was at times, and Mateo was at times, like it felt like Oregon lacked an elite defensive line as well. And like, those are the 2 areas, like in my brain, that Oregon needs to continue to get better at if they want to reach their potential. Yeah.
I looked at Oregon going into next season, and you look at Ohio State and you look at the teams that previously have won, and this is way easier said than done, but it feels like if you want to win, you got to have like a legit first, second round NFL dude at all 3 levels of the defense. And Oregon just didn't have that this season.
Yeah.
So,
and frankly, like, and I'm sure Oregon fans love him. Like, he was a really good college player. Like, I think you could do a little better at quarterback.
Yeah.
Dante Moore Dante Moore brings a different. I don't know if Dante Moore will be that guy because Dylan Gabriel was an amazing college quarterback and won a ton of games, but I think Dante Moore comes with a slightly different ceiling going into next year. What can he reach that ceiling? I have no idea, but like there's growth to be found there as well.
I would agree with that. There definitely felt like physical limitations with Gabriel. And that's not to say he's not a good quarterback. He will get picked in the NFL draft, but we learned, I think, to end the show, the difference between a first rounder, which is Bo, and a middle round guy, which is Gabriel. And those are both talented players, but nonetheless, there's a difference still. And we saw that. So
100%. Like there's just, I mean, easy for me to say as somebody who can't throw a 10-yarder out, but they're just like, they're throws that Dylan Gabriel can't make that like 5 or 10 quarterbacks in the country can. And having one of those guys can make a difference.
Cool. Well, Chris, man, thanks for coming on the show. We really appreciate your insight, and good luck the rest of the way. We'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.